most of you will know that I'm new to the role of Workforce Development Manager at the Skills Council, so I can't really lay claim to having developed or been part of delivering the WIN project to date, but I can say that I'm really happy to be newly associated with something that is so well constructed, such a well constructed model of workforce development based on best practice. As Rod has explained, the WIN project is fundamentally about supporting sustainable, high-quality aged care service delivery in the current environment of change. And that means that we need appropriately skilled people working effectively within well-led organisations, robust, innovative businesses, as well as regional partnerships. Workforce development is a critical strategy to make sure that we can meet the changing needs and the demands that are being thrown at us. But what is workforce development? And how do we know what constitutes good workforce development? So I'm going to give you a really quick snapshot of what is workforce development with some key characteristics of what constitutes best practice in workforce development. And I'd like to suggest to you that WIN is best practice. And I'm sure part of best practice, of course, is that we need to learn as we go along. So there are things for us to do differently and for us to move towards, progress towards. But it is, in my view, best practice, and it is also could be very valuable if extended nationally. It's a limitation that we only have 10 regions, essentially, and we keep getting requests for people to go outside region, and could we just come in and have the reform ready review? So that's my task in 10 minutes, or probably 8 by now. Workforce development is quite a new concept, actually, and it only really emerged in the mid-1990s when people began to acknowledge that training is not really enough on its own to respond to skills shortages. There's been a growing appreciation that effectively matching skills to jobs is a more multifaceted activity than training, and it needs to reconcile diverse goals. So we know that it's quite naive to think that training can address all elements that are necessary to achieve enough skilled workers in the right place at the right time in a rapidly changing sort of situation in a sustainable way as well. So therefore, workforce development incorporates knowledge from a whole host of other sort of disciplines, including organisational development, human resource management, workforce planning, leadership development, strategic planning, and skill development. And so we're talking about, a box set, really, of lots of different sort of ways of thinking. As one author has put it, it involves a confluence of different perspectives and actions at many different levels. So what the national and international research tells us is that successful workforce development builds the capacity of individuals and businesses and local networks in an integrated way. So we're not just talking individuals or just businesses or just networks, we're talking all of those together. And really, essentially, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. This is a recent definition that reflects that shift towards a more holistic approach about workforce development. And there's more detail to be found just in the illustrations, the examples in the videos, and also in the next couple of sessions, which are going to be the WIN workers giving us some detail about the data, what we've done, what we've achieved, and some description around that. So, a synthesis of some key messages from the literature about good workforce development, successful workforce development. I'm going to run through these and ask you to think about the WIN model, which Rod did in basic form, but also what you'll hear more about in the next 2 sessions. Think about the WIN model against these criteria. So successful workforce development is holistic. It's not one activity, even if it's a beautifully streamlined, successful activity, it's never one activity. It's a complex system of strategies that we bring together, addressing multiple interconnected needs, so well beyond the narrow perspective of individual training or qualifications. Of course, they're part of it, but they're not the whole of it. Also, best practice workforce development must be strategic, should be long-term, a long-term commitment, and there's quite a lot of research that tells you that it's very incremental. it takes its own time. And I'm sure lots of you have experience of that. But it's strategic, taking a planned approach to identify and address issues. And in the long term, there's nothing wrong with spontaneous solutions to immediate issues, but it's about having an overview of where you're heading overall. And we should be anticipating supply and demand fluctuations and a whole host of other things, which requires a moment to stop and think as opposed to just deal with what's coming at you every day, which I know is difficult. The other element is that sustained support from senior members of the workforce is really important. So the executive, the CEO needs to be on side and active in workforce development in some manner that's appropriate for whatever your business or your region is. Related to that, workforce development should be thinking about how to create, not just use leadership, but create strong leadership and leadership succession. At an individual worker level, this is an interesting one for me. Workforce development should be addressing employees' sense of recognition and connection to the workplace. So it's not just the skills they've got as an individual, it's how they feel they belong. Whether they're, the words that are used often is out of place or in place when you're in the workplace. And if people feel out of place, their productivity drops. And you'll get churn and you'll get bad attitude, as we've heard. And it reminds me that workforce development is about human beings, not productivity units, of course. I know that's stating the obvious, but I need reminding about that quite often. And that holistic engagement, that relational process in workforce development sometimes gets missed when we're doing tasks around it. Workforce development should include not only individual skill development, but also the development of enterprises. So they're viable, capable of flexibly responding to change. And this is in a business sense, as well as, it can mean, improve financial practices, for example, new technology, marketing, etc. And we'll hear examples of that in the case studies throughout the day. But it also means addressing workplace culture. So you can attract staff that you are a learning organisation, a thinking organisation, and that's a continuous cycle. And sometimes we fragment these bits of workforce development, and I think the point from the literature is it actually needs to be interconnected in some sort of, bigger picture. However, it shouldn't remain at an individual enterprise level. We should be sector-wide, so that enterprises have a commitment to developing the workforce for all. This is a tricky one, I think. It's a tricky one. Trying to get our heads around the fact that it's an investment to the whole sector that will have its returns back to you. So the sharing of resources, the sharing of effort, even the losing of staff that you've trained across to other enterprises usually comes back around. So that to have a sector-wide sort of head set is part of what makes it successful for you as an individual enterprise as well. This also relates to local and regionally based plans for workforce development. So they should be responding to unique conditions of the context that you're in within an overall arching national framework, which we're lucky to have. And the ability at the regional level, specifically and local, to decide what to do with which resources is really important. So not to be just told this is what you should do with it, but to actually problem solve it together at that regional level. There should be networks of stakeholders for this. And you decide who the stakeholders are at your level. But networks get a special mention in the literature. Finally, there should be industry-driven training. Where there is training, it needs to be industry-driven, which I think is something that we've all come to terms with. So we can now ask ourselves, how does aged care win stack up against these? And I'd like you to be thinking about that as we go through. As Rod has said again, the model involves regional networks. It seems to structurally stack up very well, actually, against these criteria. It's got regional networks designing strategic responses to workforce development needs through collaborative regional projects. It enables individual enterprises to develop through the reform-ready reviews and the co-contribution tailored grants. And businesses can and do act on the recommendations from those grants, from the reviews, sometimes without applying for a grant. So there's, sort of value add on that. And the reviews support organisational self-assessment and planning, so that there's a continuous cycle that's supported in terms of keeping on developing. The reform-ready reviews are benchmarked, and so you can also think sector-wide. Look at how you're travelling against the rest of the sector, and also set yourself some goals for improving in certain areas. We'll hear much more about that later. There's also a leadership development strategy that aligns with the WIN programme, and essentially different regions have different systems and ways of bringing this all together. So I reckon it ticks a lot of the boxes. You'll hear much more about the detail now, as I'm going to hand over to Kristen Gomes and Katie Brown, who are much more entertaining than me, I promise you. So that'll be better. But I'll leave you with this quote. That is about, it's about leading change, and it reminds us that processes need to be seeded and nurtured and perhaps organically grown more in place, more than they necessarily are bolted on or, structured. So it's ultimately the relationships and the opportunities we give each other that help us to do workforce development well. So I hope that's helped, and over to the next. Thanks.